Tung and Ha are a married couple living in a small countryside by the river where life is simple but full of laughter. Tung is a delivery driver for a small company. Although his job is not lucrative, it provides him with sufficient income to support his family. Din Ha is a kindergarten teacher who comes to school every day with the beautiful little children and loves them like their own children. They have been married for 7 years, not a long time, but long enough to understand and cherish every moment of crying together. Their small house was at the end of a simple but always bustling village road. The sound of laughter and peaceful life passed by day until one fateful afternoon that changed everything. Jiao Company assigned Tung to a long-distance shipment that day. He left home early in the morning, leaving behind the familiar instructions to stay home and be good. "I will be home a little late," he smiled, seeing him off at the gate, not forgetting to put in his bag. The lunchbox, which she had prepared since last night, arrived. Tung gently turned back to Kok, feeling bored with his wife and acting overly cautious, as if he were about to go to war. Ha smiled, her eyes sparkling, not just because she wanted him to eat well. That day, Ha had a party. Tutoring at a student's home, she rode her bike on the familiar road leading to the small house of her beloved student, Na. However, fate intervened as she crossed a car's intersection. The truck suddenly rushed forward and didn't have time to brake, hitting Ha straight on. The strong collision caused her to fall down. Blood splattered all over the road. The truck stopped. The driver panicked and ran over, but all that remained were the heart-wrenching screams of the people. Tung received a call from the hospital just as he was stopping at a roadside restaurant. His phone continued to vibrate, displaying an unfamiliar number. He picked up the phone, the voice urgent. From the other end of the line, "Are you Tung? Is that your wife? She suffered a serious accident and is currently receiving treatment at the district hospital." He quickly came. The phone fell out of his hand. Tung couldn't believe what he had just heard. He jumped up and quickly turned the car around, regardless of the distance and danger. When Tung arrived at the hospital, Ha was lying in the operating room, her face pale and motionless. His heart ached as he peered through the emergency room's glass door. The doctor walked out, his eyes serious. "We did our best. She is not in danger of losing her life, but her life is seriously damaged. She will not be able to walk again." Tung felt like falling into the abyss. Those words were like a knife cutting into his heart, but he tried to suppress his emotions and looked through the glass. His eyes were half closed and his breathing was weak. Ha woke up feeling lost and scared. Tung sat next to her, holding her hand. He smiled, his voice gentle but trembling. "It's okay. I'm here. Everything will be fine." She looked at him, tears rolling down her cheeks. She couldn't say a word. She just held his hand tightly, as if holding on to the last hope from that day on. Their lives. Turning in a completely different direction, Ha is no longer the active woman she once was. She has to lie in one place and rely on Tung's help for all her activities. The first days after the accident were filled with tears and suffering. Tung was constantly blaming himself while he struggled to balance his work and his wife's care. During the day, Dong was busy on delivery routes. At night, he rushed into the kitchen to cook rice, wipe his body, and change clothes for Ha. Even though he was tired, he still tried to keep a smile on his lips whenever he was with her. Tung always encouraged Ha with humorous high stories or turned on her favorite movies, but no matter how hard he tried, he still couldn't. Hiding the pain in my heart, there were nights when I woke up and saw Ha facing the wall, her thin shoulders shaking in the dark. I quietly hugged her and whispered, "Everything will be fine. Don't worry," but deep down I know. Financial pressure weighed heavily on Tung's shoulders. Nothing remained as it had before. The cost of Ha's medical treatment increased day by day. The delivery work was not enough for the farm, and he had to borrow money from friends and relatives. Even as he was mortgaging the small house, gossip from the neighbors started to surface. Tongue was really guilty. He was so young that he had to take on the burden of a disabled wife. Those words were like salt on his heart, but Tongue never showed it. Tired in front of Ha while living in guilt and torment, she knew Tongue had sacrificed too much for her. She felt like a selfish person holding him in a confined life. Every time Tongue came home, she tried to smile weakly, but her eyes could not hide her deep sadness. She thought about divorce, but every time she wanted to say it, she did not have enough courage. She was afraid that if she lost Tongue, she would have nothing left to hold on to. Those days tested both Tongue and Ha's love and patience. Tongue deeply loved Ha, yet he was also human and occasionally prone to weakness. He spent long nights with blankets teasing him, wondering if he was doing the right thing, if Ha was truly happy, or if he was just enduring his sacrifice. However, every time he looked into her eyes, he dismissed all doubts. "We are husband and wife. I promise to take care of you. For the rest of my life," I silently told myself, as an affirmation, to believe in it in the darkness of despair. Tongue and Ha still clung to each other like two incomplete puzzle pieces. Perfect, but inseparable. But they do not know that greater challenges await ahead. Challenges that will make both of them face their own hearts. After the terrible incident, Tongue and Ha's life turned to a completely different chapter full of challenges and nameless pains. Ha, once an active and independent woman, has now become completely dependent on her husband's care. To Tongue Ha, she is not only his wife, but also his companion throughout his life. But now the image of that friend is just a weak body lying quietly on a small bed in the middle of a silent house. The first days after the accident were filled with pain, not only physically, but also mentally. He could not accept the fact that she would never walk again. She fell into a state of severe depression. She refused to eat, drink, or communicate with anyone, including Tongue. The tears that silently rolled down Ha's pillow every night were proof of the unspeakable pain she felt. She not only lost the ability to walk, but Tongue, despite being in pain and tired, still tried to become a solid support for his wife. He learned how to take care of Ha from the smallest things, like wiping her body. He wakes up early to prepare everything before leaving for work. The delivery job is increasingly stressful when he has to shoulder the additional cost of medicine and physical therapy for Ha. Each trip he takes while riding on the small truck, his eyes were constantly focused forward, but his mind was continually preoccupied with thoughts of his wife, who was left alone at home. At night, despite his exhaustion from leaving prison, I cooked, cleaned the house, and sat by his side. I sat next to Ha, telling her humorous stories. At work, he turned on her favorite movies, trying to make her laugh, but Ha's smile now was just a faint curve, no longer as bright as before. He always said, "You don't need to do all these things. I'm not worth your sacrifice," but Tongue just smiled and quietly held her hand. "You are my wife, my whole world. As long as you are still here, everything else is not important. However, love is not always enough to soothe all pain." Tongue's sacrifice could not avoid the criticism from the people around him in the small neighborhood. The last time I heard people whispering about Tongue, they expressed regret that he was so young and had to support a disabled wife. I wonder if he regretted it, or if that Ha girl really loved her husband or just clung to him because she had no one else. Every time he heard it, Tongue just silently walked past, but those words were like knives stabbing deep into his self-esteem. That pressure gradually exhausted Tongue. One time, when he was feeding porridge to Ha, An quietly looked at her. For a long time, his eyes contained both love and fatigue. He sensed this and immediately inquired, "What's wrong?" Tongue quickly shook his head and tried to smile. "It's nothing. Eat a little more?" But in his heart, filled with unanswered questions, am I doing well enough? Am I truly happy in this life? Or am I just holding on to something that no longer has meaning? Since the accident, she had been living in a state of feeling helpless and constantly tormented. She felt like a heavy burden on Tung's shoulders. She clearly saw the fatigued lines on her husband's face every night when he returned home after a day of work. One day, after a long day of work, Tung fell asleep on the chair next to Ha Langlei's bed. Looking at him for a long time, tears welled up. He had sacrificed too much for me. I was not worthy, she thought to herself. That pain gradually turned into the thought of wanting to solve the problem. Free Tung Ha started thinking about divorce. She thought that without her, Tung would be free and find another woman who was more worthy and could bring him true happiness. But every time she wanted to say it, she didn't have enough courage. She was afraid that if she lost Tung, she would have nothing left to hold on to. With no one by her side, it was a fierce psychological battle that only she understood. One afternoon, Tung returned home earlier than usual. When Tung finished delivering the goods early and entered the house, he saw Ha struggling to reach for an item on the table next to the bed. Her arms were shaking and her eyes were red. Tung ran to help her, but what hurt him the most was her eyes. Sadness and helplessness. "I'm sorry. I just want to do a little work by myself," he whispered. Tung remained silent, simply giving her a tight hug. But in his heart, he felt as though hundreds of needles were piercing him, leaving him helpless and unsure of how to alleviate her pain. As the days passed, both Tung and Ha had to learn to cope with their own pain. However, they were unaware that the real challenge lay ahead, when their love would have to confront doubts and hurts they had never anticipated. Despite fatigue and helplessness, they can only hope that love will keep them together, no matter how dark the road ahead. Tung and Ha's life continued to flow in patience and endurance as Tung's long days were repetitive with work. Taking care of his wife and facing gossip from the neighbors, Ha, although gradually getting used to life tied to a bed and wheelchair, still cannot escape the feeling of helplessness and torment. Their love is like a candle. They are weakly swaying in the wind, trying to cling to each other to preserve the faint light of a morning unlike any other. Tung left home early to embark on a long-distance delivery trip, but not before I meticulously reviewed the lunchbox papers I had prepared the night before and made sure to share them with Ha. "Remember to eat breakfast and don't let yourself go hungry. I'll call you when I get home at noon." Ha just smiled slightly and nodded. She made Tung somewhat reassured. He left with a feeling of relief, not knowing that day would change everything in his life. Tung's trip went smoothly until he suddenly realized that he had forgotten his lunchbox on the bus. The kitchen table truck was halfway there, but the thought of having to eat dry bread made him uncomfortable. After a moment of consideration, he decided it wouldn't take long to turn around and go home. He told himself to speed up on the familiar road. When the car stopped in front of the house, everything was still quiet as usual. Tung stepped into the house. The atmosphere was so familiar that he didn't notice anything else, but when he approached the bedroom, he was surprised. Suddenly, he stopped at the crack of the slightly open door, a sight that made him uncomfortable. Freeze in the small room. He was sitting on the bed facing a strange man. That man was not a complete stranger who had only seen him in some old photos of Ha. His name is Hui, Ha's best friend since university. Tung remembers Ha telling him about Hui, but he never thought that Hui would appear in their house right now. They sat close to each other, and what hurt Tung the most was Hui holding Ha's hand. She was sobbing, her thin shoulders shaking. Tung felt like everything around him was collapsing. The pain radiated from his chest, as if someone had torn out his heart. He didn't know what to do. He just stood there for a moment, his eyes glued to the scene before him. The crowd's gossip captivated him. The neighborhood suddenly rang in his head, clear and sharp like needles. A wife like this probably only clings to her husband and doesn't love him anymore. In the room, Hui gently patted Ha. His voice was warm and gentle. "Don't think too much. I know you're miserable, but I will always be here to help you. Don't torture yourself like that anymore," she sobbed, her voice choked. I don't want him to suffer. Suffering because of me too, hey. I don't deserve him to sacrifice his whole life like that. He deserves a better life. Tung couldn't bear it anymore. He silently turned around. Each step felt heavy, as if he was carrying something. Stones. He didn't want to go in to face Ha or get an explanation from her. The feeling of bitterness, doubt, and hurt filled his mind. In his head, the intimate images between Ha and Hui repeated over and over again. He re-entered the car, unable to stop the pain, but he refrained from driving away immediately. His hands gripped the steering wheel, nails dug into his palms so hard it hurt. A part of him wanted to believe he was just misinterpreting the situation, but he didn't. How can I erase what I just saw? How can I forget the tears in Ha's eyes as she gazed at Hui Tung, feeling overwhelmed? Has all his dedication and sacrifices over the years resulted in betrayal and deception? The pain he was experiencing now was the greatest of his life. That whole day, Tung drove like a soulless person. The familiar roads suddenly became strange and obscure. He could no longer focus on work. Thinking about Ha's words about Hui's presence in her house, what does she really want? Does she still love her? Or is it all just tolerance that she doesn't dare to say those questions out loud? Tung's mind was surrounded, making it impossible for him to escape. That night, Tung returned home later than usual. She was asleep, or at least she pretended to be, so he wouldn't wake her up. She just sat quietly beside her, looking at her thin face. Under the open light and his heart filled with conflicting emotions, love, anger, hurt, and a little fear, he was afraid that if he asked her, he would get an answer he didn't want to hear, but he also knew if he didn't, faced with the truth, he would never escape the doubts that were weighing on him. The next day, Tung decided to talk to Ha. After dinner, he sat down in front of her. His eyes were serious but filled with pain. Ha-an began to speak in a deep and heavy voice. Yesterday, I saw Hui here. Can you explain to me what's going on? Startled, she opened her eyes wide, her gaze bewildered. She didn't anticipate that Tung would be aware of this situation, nor did she anticipate his direct question. She bowed her head, her hands clasped together, her voice trembling. Hui was my best friend since college. He only came to visit me, bringing me some medicine and helping me when he was busy. He and she are truly one. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she said her last words. Tung looked at her eyes, full of doubt. There is nothing. So why is he holding your hand again? Why did you cry in front of him? Do you know how I felt when I saw that? Do you know how much pain I was in? His voice choked up, but his eyes still didn't leave. He couldn't answer. They exchanged words immediately. She knew how to cry. Her sobs filled the small room like they were trying to choke you. After a while, she choked. I just feel like I'm not worthy of you. I don't want you to suffer because of me. I thought about letting go, but I didn't have the courage. I was afraid of hurting you, but I was also afraid that I couldn't bear it without you. Ha's words made Tung feel as though someone was tightly gripping his heart. He doesn't know what to do or what to believe. She didn't betray him, but her remorse and despair are what hurt him the most. Tung stood up and walked away, going out and leaving. Sitting there, her thin shoulders shaking in her endless crying that night, Tung sat on the chair in the living room, staring at the ceiling, his mind in turmoil. Misunderstandings and unspoken pain suffocated their love, even though he knew he loved her and she loved him too. He wondered if this love was strong enough to overcome everything, or was he wrong to try to hold on to her? The answer was still unclear, but Tung knew that something had to change, and he would have to be the one to face the truth no matter how painful it was. That night, Tung sat quietly in the darkness, his eyes trailing faint streaks of light. The streetlight illuminated the window, causing his heart to feel oppressed. He was experiencing mixed emotions that he didn't know how to resolve. Perhaps he was still in the bedroom? She cried until she was exhausted and fell asleep, but her sobs still echoed in his mind. reminding him that there was an undeniable distance between them. The next morning, Tung woke up earlier than usual. He didn't cook. He didn't prepare breakfast as usual. Instead, he sat down opposite Ha with a serious look, but could not hide the pain. He looked at him with red eyes after a long, sleepless night. Did he say what he wanted to say? Tung began. His voice was low and heavy. Ha nodded slightly. Tung tightly clasped her hands on his knees, indicating that he needed more time. Tung uttered each word with the intensity of a sea gas explosion. I think we both need time to think about everything. I will be away for a few days. Don't worry, I'm back. She looked up, her eyes slightly misted. Scared. Where are you going? Is it because of me? I'm sorry, I don't want to hurt you. Her voice trembled with tears. Sparkling in the corner of TNG's eyes, he shook his head and held her hand. It's okay, but I need to think about what I can do to make us both feel less tired. Rest, and don't worry, I'll be back. I stood up and walked out the door before he could say anything more. I felt a tearing sensation in my heart, yet I understood that if I didn't take this action, we would both persist, sink deeper into the pain. There is no way out. Tung drove towards the countryside where he had delivered goods many years ago, a peaceful place with vast rice fields and small houses scattered along the dirt road. He rented a small room near the river and decided to take a few days to look back at myself and the love I have cultivated over the past 5 years. During the day, I sit by the riverbank watching the water flow slowly. I listen to the wind rustling through the bamboo trees. At night, I lie on my bed. I stared at the ceiling, my mind teeming with contradictory ideas. He remembered the first days when Ha had just had an accident, when she was lying motionless on the hospital bed and her eyes were full of fear. He had promised her that he would never leave her and take care of her for the rest of his life, but now he began to wonder if his love would really make her happy or just make her more miserable. He could feel it. He could sense Ha's pain and helplessness as she gradually became dependent on him, but he was unsure of how to alleviate this feeling for both of them. One afternoon, while walking along the village road, Tung suddenly saw a fake couple sitting on the porch together, peeling corn that had just been picked from the garden. They didn't say anything, just worked silently, but the look in their eyes when they looked at each other contained an indescribable peace. That image made Tung suddenly realize that love is not always about flowery words or outstanding actions. Sometimes love is simply about being present and facing all the difficulties in life together. Tung turned coming home on a rainy night. The road leading to the village was dark. Only the light from car headlights shone on the wet road. He stopped the car in front of the gate, took off his raincoat, and entered the house. The air inside was cold and silent. But when he entered the bedroom, a sight left him speechless. Ha was lying on the edge of the bed, trying to reach for a glass on the table beside her. Her arms were shaking, and her face was pale. Covered in sweat, Tung rushed to catch her before she fell. "What are you doing? Why didn't you call me?" Tung shouted, his voice trembling with fear and sorrow. He didn't answer. He just burst into tears in Tung's arms, carried her back to bed, got a glass of water and gave it to her. When she finished drinking, he sat down next to her and held her hand. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I shouldn't have left you alone like that. I couldn't bear it. When I saw I'm in pain like this, I'm everything to you, and you'll never let me suffer alone again. Looking at you, tears still rolling down my cheeks, I thought you wouldn't come back. I thought you were tired of you. Her voice broke each word as if to strangle Tung-an's heart. She held her hand tightly, her eyes full of determination. No, Ha-an, I will never leave you. No matter how difficult it is, no matter what I have to face, I will still be here by your side that night. Tung sat by Ha's bed, holding her hand tightly all night long. While the rain continued to fall outside, All the conflicts and doubts in his heart seemed to vanish, leading him to understand that love is more than just sacrifice. Sharing is about overcoming all difficulties together, no matter how bumpy the road ahead is. The next day, Tung started planning to change. Ha-an decided to leave his job as a driver and establish a small grocery store at home. He knew this wouldn't make much money, but it would give him more time with Ha and her care. Tung's encouragement helped her feel like she was still an important part of life. Gradually regaining her spirit, she started to participate in arranging goods in the store, doing small things that she could. Tung always praised her, even for the smallest things, and his words of encouragement made Ha feel like she was no longer a burden, but rather his true companion in life. Their life gradually stabilized again, but Tung, knowing this journey still has many challenges and difficulties, is ready because he understands that as long as they are together, nothing can defeat their love after that fateful rainy night. At times, Tung and Ha's life appeared to take a new turn. Tung no longer let doubts and hurt affect his love. He realized that instead of letting negative emotions gnaw at him, he had to act. The decision to open a small grocery store at home was not only an economic solution, but also a way for him and Ha to have more time together in the early days of starting a new job, which was not easy. Tung had to borrow money from friends to buy goods and equip the most basic things for their grocery store. Their store only sold essential items such as instant noodles, rice, cooking oil, and a few household items from the neighbors in the village. Still looking at Tung with curious eyes, even a bit of pity, he probably wanted to stay home to take care of his wife more conveniently. But what good would it be? Those words sometimes still echoed behind Tung's back, but this time he didn't let them bother him. He just smiled and continued working. After lying on the bed, he gradually began to participate in light work in the shop. She couldn't move much, but every time Tung pushed the cart, she rolled her arms to the front of the counter and helped him arrange the items on shelves and check quantity. Those little things helped Ha feel that she still valued and could contribute to their life together every time she saw him. When she does something, no matter how small or insignificant, she doesn't hesitate to praise her. "You're so good. I can't do as well as you." Those words of encouragement not only make her smile, but also give her more motivation. She no longer has to. Instead of feeling like a burden to Tung, she started to believe that she could still play a significant role in his life. Now, on days when the shop was quiet, Tung often pushed Ha's wheelchair to the porch, and they sat there together. Their relationship grows as they watch the neighborhood kids play and tell each other stories, even if they're small. The efforts made by both of them began to pay off. Their grocery store gradually became familiar to the people in the neighborhood. Admiration replaced the previous looks of pity. The neighbors began to look at them. Tung is like a model man, but is also a strong woman who does not surrender to fate. Some people come to buy goods. They do not even hesitate to tell Tung that he is a wonderful husband and his wife is very lucky. Smiled and replied humbly, "No, I'm the lucky one to have her." Life gradually stabilized, but Tung and Ha knew that things were never completely easy. Financial difficulties were always there. Existence and life's challenges still occasionally appear to test their love and patience. One morning, while arranging goods, Tung received a call from a strange number, and a voice from the other side of the bat made me surprised. "On Tung, this is Hui. Can I meet you?" Do you want to talk about Hui, the name that made Tung feel insecure and hurt after what happened? Tung no longer holds feelings. He did not feel jealous or frustrated with Hui, but he still couldn't be completely comfortable thinking about him. However, after a moment of thought, Tung agreed to meet them at a small coffee shop in town. When Hui came, he brought a worn face, but his eyes were still full of sincerity. Hui started with an apology. "I'm sorry for coming to your house without notice at that time. My intention was to alleviate Ha's discomfort. I may feel lonely. but I don't believe that would harm you." Tung silently looked at Hui with a calm gaze. He wasn't angry, but he wanted to know what you and Ha really said to each other that day. Hui sighed, his eyes full of emotion. "She told me that she always felt like a burden to him. She was afraid that he had to sacrifice too much and didn't dare tell him. I just wanted her to understand that he loved her not because of responsibility, but because of true love." Tung heard Hui's words and felt relieved. He realized that Hui was not the one who interfered in their lives, but was just a true friend who wanted to help Ha overcome the difficulties. "My pain." "Thank you, Hui," Tung said in a gentle but determined English voice. He wanted her to understand that from now on, he will be the only one to do that for her. He will not let her. He felt lonely or insecure after that meeting. Tung returned home with a new confidence and his love. He no longer doubted or wondered. Instead, he focused completely on making Ha happy. Every day he tries to find a way to make her smile so she can forget her physical and mental pain. He also feels a change in him. She no longer sees fatigued eyes or pressure in the mirror. She no longer saw fatigued eyes or pressure in the mirror. Instead, she saw a strong love. Nothing could shake one afternoon. Tung pushed Ha's wheelchair out to the backyard to watch the sunset. The sun was slowly setting, dyeing the sky with orange and pink stripes. The gentle breeze blew, carrying the scent of grass. Tung sat down next to Ha, holding her hand. You know, no matter what happens, no matter how difficult it is, I will never leave you. You are my whole world." She looked at him, tears rolling down her cheeks. But this time, they were not tears of pain, but of happiness. She softly said, "Thank you, Tung. Thank you for not giving up. I remember when you were exhausted, but still here." To me, they all sat there in the soft sunset light. The hardships were still there, but now they had learned to cope together. Their love is not just sacrifice or responsibility, but companionship. And sharing is the true meaning of life they have found together.